Hello and welcome to the show that still doesn't have a name. I am your host, Pannobhasa, who ironically has more than one name. So maybe that's one reason why the show doesn't have a name, because I just have too many. Anyway, there has been a little bit of talk lately about the history of Theravada. There's a certain person that I won't name who has claimed that Theravada Buddhism did not even exist until 600 years after the formation of the five Nikayas. And for those of you who aren't really keen on Buddhist texts, the five Nikayas are the collections of discourses of the Buddha, the suttas, or in Mahayana Buddhism and Sanskrit, it would be called sutras. So this person who claims to be an authority, if not the authority on early Buddhism, says that Theravada did not exist until 600 years after the time that the sutras were collected. And so I would just like to give a pretty much standard mainstream brief history of Theravada Buddhism. Buddhism in general, but mostly Theravada. So we can say that the first schism in Buddhism occurred during the Buddha's own lifetime, according to the text, and that was the schism that was started by the Buddha's cousin and I think also his brother-in-law, Devadatta. And Devadatta wanted Buddhism to be more strict. Like he wanted monks only to eat alms food, not to be like accept invitations to people's houses. Monks had to be vegetarian. They had to wear only rag robes, that sort of thing. And the Buddha said these things are optional. I mean, you can be a vegetarian if you want. You can eat only alms food if you want, but he wasn't going to make it mandatory. And so, according to the tradition, Devadatta started a schism, got a bunch of monks to follow him, but the schism was ended by one or both of the Buddhist chief disciples. I'm too lazy to look it up and refresh my memory, going and reconverting the monks back to the Buddha's own teachings, which caused Devadatta supposedly to vomit hot blood and die, and he fell straight into the lowest pits of hell. Although one of the early Chinese pilgrims who went to India looking for authentic Buddhist texts said that around, I think it was Bodh Gaya, he came across a monastery that consisted of monks who professed being followers of Devadatta. They honored all Buddhas except Gautama. So it may be there really was a schism that lasted for hundreds of years and then eventually died out. But traditionally, they say that the schisms in Buddhism, the division of Buddhism into different schools of Buddhism, began at or shortly after the Second Council. So the first council was immediately after the death or parinibbana of the Buddha. And the purpose of that was primarily to establish some kind of code of monastic discipline. If you read between the lines, like in the history, the canonical history of the first council, after the Buddha died, a lot of monks were very dejected over this, and there was one monk who was ordained when he was older, and monks who are ordained later in life are notoriously hard to teach. They're just set in their ways and don't change easily. And he's just saying essentially, why all the long faces? Now we don't have the Buddha saying, do this, don't do that all the time. We can do what we please. And Venerable Mahakassapa, who was the senior monk in the Sangha after the Buddha died, was alarmed by this and decided they better have a council to, get things set, to get sort of come up with like an official doctrine, and especially some kind of code of monastic discipline, at least with regard to like the Patimokkha rules, the basic framework of rules that monks are required to follow, and probably also some protocols for ordination procedures and so forth. So things proceeded, relatively smoothly, I suppose, for, according to Theravada Buddhism, it was like 100 years. A lot of scholars now are saying that the Second Council occurred maybe 70 years after the time of the Buddha, but the schism itself may have occurred 100 years after the time of the Buddha. But according to one bit of evidence they have for that is that according to the canonical account of the Second Council, the Theravadan canonical account, which is found in the Chulavagga of the Vinaya Pitaka, there was a disciple of Ananda who was the Buddha's attendant. That there was a monk who was ordained by Ananda who attended the Second Council on the side of the Theras. So 100 years later, I mean, that would be pushing it. He'd be over 120 years old, but 70 years is maybe doable. So the reason for the Second Council, it was a sort of debate that the monks of the East, which was mainly the Buddha's own stomping grounds, like the eastern Ganges Valley, they had started handling money according to the Theravadan approach, or the Theravadan, the account of the Second Council. A lot of monks in the East had started handling money. They started being more lax with regard to the rules. And the monks that were farther to the West were still strictly following Vinaya. Although, if you read other accounts from other schools of Buddhism of the same Second Council, like I think it was Mahayana chroniclers were saying, or even pre-Mahayana chroniclers from the other side of the debate, they were saying that the whole thing was not so much with regard to monastic discipline, it was with regard to like doctrine, especially the idea of whether or not an enlightened being can backslide and become unenlightened again. And the monks of the East were saying, yeah, maybe they can, whereas the Theras, or the monks of the West, were saying, no, once you become enlightened, there's no falling back. And there's more evidence in support of that point of view in the texts than saying that a monk can backslide. But that's kind of sad to me that even 100 years later, they're already starting to argue over whether or not an enlightened being can be this way or that way, which seems to indicate that 100 years after the time of the Buddha, there were no enlightened beings to consult. Just ask them. So, between 70 and 100 years after the parinibbana of the Buddha, there was a Second Council. And both sides agree. I mean, like both sects of Buddhism derived from both of these different factions agree that the monks of the West won the debate. So, regardless of whether it was regard to monastic discipline, like whether it's okay for monks to handle money, or whether it was a doctrinal issue of whether arahants can backslide and become unenlightened again, both sides agree that the monks of the West won the debate. But even so, shortly after the Second Council, partly just through isolation, because travel, especially monks in ancient India, they really couldn't travel faster than a person can walk. It was against the rules from to ride horses or anything. And so just through isolation, sort of the way evolution supposedly works, you've got an isolated population, it can just sort of start drifting in a different direction just because you've got like a charismatic teacher who emphasizes certain points, for example, or for whatever reason, just the isolation in ancient times can cause different schools of Buddhism or just different monasteries to move in different directions, kind of drifting apart. There's not necessarily any malevolent motives, which I've seen people saying, that monks just destroyed Buddhism on purpose. They just started adding all these bullshit, ideologies and so forth. But no, I don't think that monks who had dedicated their lives to practicing the teaching of the Buddha were going to deliberately wreck their own religion. So, partly because of that, the different schools of Buddhism, or just different like Buddhist areas, were just kind of drifting away from each other. And so you had the first schism approximately 100 years after the time of the Buddha. And according to Theravada, you had the Theras and the Vajjiputtakas. although most historians will say that you had the Staviras, which is just Sanskrit for Teras, that were one branch, and then the rest, the other branch was the Mahasangika branch. And so you can say that, even right after the first council, 100 years after the time of the Buddha, one of the two main branches of Buddhism was still called the Teras, or in Sanskrit, Stavira, but in all likelihood, the monks themselves weren't calling themselves Stavira because they were using either the Pali language or a language similar to Pali. That using Sanskrit as a Buddhist textual language was a later development that was adopted by some later schools of Buddhism. But I think the Buddha himself probably spoke a language similar to Pali, although the experts now are saying that Pali itself was like an artificial ecclesiastical language based on the original language of the Buddha, but then as Theravada, or the Teras, the Stavira branch, was pushed farther and farther west, that it started adopting linguistic characteristics of monks in the more western areas, and it turned into a kind of lingua franca, where it wasn't exactly the language of any of the monks where the Teras were predominant, but it was similar enough to all of them that it was sort of mutually intelligible, and the monks were using that as an ecclesiastical language. So what happened was, ironically, the Teras lost the main area that the Buddha lived in. That it was the Mahasangika branch, what in the ancient texts of Theravada called the Vajjiputtakas, or the sons of the Vajjis, which was a small nation in that area. The Mahasangika branch, or the Vajjiputtakas, were the ones who retained the Buddha's own, the area that he wandered around in and taught Dhamma in. And the Stavira, or the Tera branch, was pushed farther and farther west, and then it started being pushed farther and farther south. There was a school called let's see what it's called here, the Haimavatas, according to an early Sanskrit Buddhist chronicler named Vasumitra. He said that, and there are other scholars nowadays who say the same thing, that there was a Haimavata school of Buddhism that was very similar to Theravada, that remained in the north for centuries. But most of the Theravada sect or school was pushed farther and farther south until by relatively early times, by maybe the beginning of the Common Era, almost all of Theravada was in southern India and Sri Lanka. And I don't know where the claim comes from that Theravada didn't exist for 600 years, because by the Third Council, almost all of the scriptures or canonical texts of Theravada were already established. There was a few sort of fringe, obscure texts like the Vinaya Parivara that were composed after the Third Council. But the Third Council, which was held during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka, which is mid-3rd century BCE. So that would be a few hundred years after the time of the Buddha. There is some evidence to suggest that the main reason for holding the Third Council was to act as a purge. There had been different monasteries within the Stavira branch that were starting to teach more and more different things. This principle of isolation and drifting apart was still happening. And so you had two main branches within the Teras, or the Staviras, the Proto-Theravadins, you can call them, and the Sarvastivadins. And the Sarvastivadins, they had some, they were very similar to Theravada. They're very close to Theravada in most respects, but they did have some differences. For example, just the name Sarvastivada means the doctrine that all exists. And mainly that means that the Sarvastivadins were teaching that past, present, and future all are existent. Not exactly at the same time, but it's sort of like a Einsteinian approach. Time is the fourth dimension, and so the past, the present, and the future are, in a sense, all existing. And the Theravadins just say only the present moment exists. So that was one main difference. The Sarvastivadins had also turned karma almost into a material substance, which is strange. It's sort of like what the Jains believed. Also, the Sarvastivadins took the idea that all conditioned things are impermanent, like the principle of anicca. And they said that the individual dharmas or the individual elements are not impermanent. They are eternal, sort of like an atom, or like an electron or something. Well, maybe an electron's not a good example, but that it's only the formations, like the compounds, the accumulations of these primordial elemental dharmas that are impermanent. Whereas in Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, even the elemental particles are flashing in and out of existence at like a trillion times per second. And also, the Sarvastivadins and the Theravadins, by the time of the Third Council, had already established two entirely different Abhidhamma philosophies. That the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma, because they started using Sanskrit, so they called it Abhidharma. There's not a single book that is the same between Theravada and Sarvastivada. On the other hand, the suttas, they're probably, at least 70% the same, maybe as much as 90% identical between the ancient schools. And also the Vinaya, or the rules of monastic discipline, are very similar. Some of the details differ, but the main gist of the rules is almost the same. Like the Patimokkha is almost the same between the various schools, including Theravada and Sarvastivada, which, as I say, were closely related. So, as I was saying, the probable purpose of the Third Council, which was mid-3rd century BC, was to establish orthodox doctrine, sort of like the early Christian councils. And the Sarvastivadins got booted out of the Theravada Sangha, and apparently a lot of them moved towards the northwest into what is now Pakistan, and that became a stronghold of the Sarvastivadins. Whereas Theravada kept getting pushed farther and farther south, which in a way was a good thing, because by the time the Muslims invaded India and were essentially slaughtering all the Buddhists and destroying all the monasteries, the Muslims didn't have a navy, and so they couldn't cross over into Sri Lanka and persecute the Theravadins out of existence. But I think I might be getting a little ahead of myself. There apparently was there was a fourth council, I think it was, maybe a fifth one. I can't remember which number it was, but it was held by King Kanishka, who had converted to Sarvastivada Buddhism. His capital city was in what is now Pakistan. And of course, it got worked out so that the Sarvastivadins were right and everybody else was wrong. So the Theravadins and pretty much everybody else rejected the authority of that council. Going with Theravadan history, the fourth council was held in Sri Lanka, and that was the council. It was about 500 years after the time of the Buddha, where they decided to write down the texts, because up until 500 years after the time of the Buddha, the scriptures were just memorized. And anybody who reads Pali texts can tell you they can be very tedious because they're so repetitive. But I know from experience that if you're reciting a text or memorizing one, that you look forward to the repetition because it makes it easier. It's sort of like poetry. It just makes it easier to remember it. And it turned out that there was one text called the Nadesa, that it got to the point where there was only one monk left alive who knew it by heart. There were persecutions in Sri Lanka. Every once in a while you'd have a Hindu king who would persecute the Buddhists. And same happened in southern India. And so personally, the Nadesa is just kind of a junk text. You can learn anthropological things, but you're not going to learn much real Buddhism from reading it. it's a kind of commentary to some really, really archaic ancient texts in the Sutta Nipata. And the purpose is not so much to explain them, but rather to explain them away, because these texts in the Sutta Nipata are so ancient that they're pre-Theravadan, they're like pre-Orthodox. And so they're too well known to reject them, just, like edit them out of the canon. But so they had to like reinterpret them to make them more orthodox. So when it says, for example, that a monk should have no view, it just says, well, he should have no wrong view, which almost is, it makes it kind of pointless. Why would the Buddha bother to tell people don't believe what is false? He was essentially saying don't believe anything. But we needn't get into that because it's so easily misinterpreted, because he really was not a skeptic. So let's see, fifth council was, no, the fourth council was in Sri Lanka. The fifth and sixth councils were both in Burma, and that was in modern times. And both times it was pretty much unnecessary. Nothing really important was accomplished, except maybe the sixth council held in 1956 in Rangoon. The main result of that was just spreading the Mahasi method around the world, because Mahasi Sayadaw was the questioner of the Sixth Council. But yeah, the main point I'm trying to make here is that even right after the Second Council, when the first schism occurred, one of the two main branches, even by the Mahayana sects, by the non-Theravadan sects, were calling one of these two branches the Staviras, which is just Sanskrit for Theras or elders. So a kind of proto-Theravada has existed at least as far back as 100 years after the time of the Buddha. You can argue that Theravada as it exists today hasn't existed for that long. But then again, Theravada as it exists today didn't exist until today, because it's, there's always this gradual change. There's always impermanence or anicca. So you can continue with some of the history of Theravada Buddhism by following into Sri Lanka. According to the legend, the Emperor Ashoka's own son and daughter, who were ordained as a monk and a nun, were sent to Sri Lanka as missionaries. And that was one of the few places where they were successful in establishing Buddhism. They were missionaries sent by Ashoka into even like the Greek kingdoms of the West, but they didn't really strike traction. And there were two main monasteries that were like the centers of, like the ideological centers of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. One was called the Mahavihara, and one was called, ironically, Abhayagiri, which is the same name as the Ajahn Chah Monastery in California. And those were the heretics. Those were the ones who were adopting Mahayanist views. And Mahayana was kind of a progressive movement in Buddhism, whereas the Mahavihara was more conservative. And the scholars agree that Theravada is one of the most conservative, even of the ancient schools, like the pre-Mahayana schools. The Theras were really some of the most conservative with regard to preserving the ancient texts and not monkeying with them. So the Mahavihara, after its ups and downs, it prevailed, and there was a monk named Buddhaghosa who compiled an elaborate commentarial system, which, if you wanted to, you could say Theravada didn't really exist until the time of Buddhaghosa, where he established the commentarial tradition that is like the official interpretation of the texts that have been, almost all of them have remained unchanged since, the first or second, or at the very latest, the third council. Like Abhidhamma-Pitaka was probably added at the third council. In fact, one of the books of the Abhidhamma-Pitaka was, it's called the Katha-Watu, and it's points of controversy. That's how you can interpret the name Katha-Watu. Kata can mean controversy, Watu is like points or grounds. And it was like a manual for aiding Theravada Buddhists in debating other schools of Buddhism. So it has like the names of the other schools of Buddhism, or at least it's describing other schools of Buddhism who had their own different theories. Like I've mentioned in recent blog posts that there was an ancient sect called the Pudgalavadins who believed in a Pudgala, which means an individual. But even, I mean, this they branched away probably before the time of Ashoka. There were many sects of Buddhism even before the time of Ashoka in the third century BC. And the Pudgalavadins believed in an individual, but they could not believe in an atta or a self because that was so well established as heresy by the time that they were formed, maybe 200 years after the time of the Buddha. That I mean, they couldn't assert the existence of a self, so they had to use a different word. So anyway, you have the commentaries composed in South India and Sri Lanka, um, with Buddhaghosa being like the primary compiler and editor of the commentarial tradition. And then sub-commentaries and sub-commentaries have were composed well up into the 1700s, maybe the 1800s. And Theravada was driven out of its homeland by competing sects of Buddhism, and then it was pretty much killed off um, in the southern India by, or else just outcompeted by Hindus or other schools of Buddhism. And so it was mainly from Sri Lanka that it spread out to other parts of Southeast Asia, where it continues to exist today. In fact, it got so corrupted in Sri Lanka that they had to send for Burmese and I think also some Thai monks to come back and reestablish the Sangha because the Sri Lankan monks in medieval times had become so corrupt that they were pretty much all parajika or just excommunicated. Technically, they weren't monks anymore. They were like getting married and having kids and that sort of thing. So anyway, I think that pretty much brings us to the present day. And the main point is that Theravada, or at least Proto-Theravada, has existed really since the time of the Nikayas. At least Proto-Theravada has existed since the suttas were composed. And some of the suttas just are Theravadan suttas that got added after the first schism. But it is I should add that it is a naive belief that any texts that all of the ancient schools or almost all of them hold in common are then reliably the teachings of the Buddha because the first all it means is that they predate the first schism. After the schisms, then you got continued drifting apart and modification of texts or adding new texts or eliminating old texts. For example, even the Sarvastivada school has slightly different suttas and slightly different rules of monastic discipline than the Theravadins. For example, in the Majjhima Nikaya, in Theravada, you've got the Jivaka Sutta, where Jivaka tells the Buddha that some of the non-Buddhists are accusing the Buddhists of being in favor of killing because Buddhist monks eat meat. And the Buddha says, no, they're not really in favor of killing. They're just, eating whatever people put into their bowl. And however, a monk is forbidden to eat any meat that he sees, hears, or suspects has been killed for his sake. But the Sarvastivadins essentially converted to vegetarianism, and so they edited that sutta out. That's probably more likely than the idea that the Theravadins just cooked it up, because it is pretty obvious that the Buddha himself ate meat. And the ancient rules of monastic discipline mention that a monk isn't allowed to ask for meat unless he's sick. Even Mahayana schools still have these vestigial meat-eating rules that they just ignore because they don't follow the Vinaya anymore, or the rules of monastic discipline anymore. So I guess that's my brief history of Theravada is turning into a long one, so I guess I'd better end this. But it really is interesting, and it's all available. You can there are ancient chroniclers, there are modern scholars that are studying like the edicts of Ashoka. That one of the edicts of Ashoka has, or at least one, has a list of recommended readings in Buddhist texts. And I'm pretty sure at least two of the suttas that are mentioned on that list come from the Sutta Nipata. At least one of them comes from the Atthaka Vagga. Um, but yeah, I think I'm just rambling now. So I think we'll just end this now and be happy.